chick flicks, romantic comedies, rom-coms. We love them, you hate them, but we are here to eviscerate them. Welcome to the RomCom Killjoys podcast. I'm your host, Jonelle Walker. Now, let's get on with some feminist joy killing. All right, everybody, welcome back to the show. The world continues to be in a state of both great mourning and tension, but also uplift and celebration as we continue in uprisings for Black life and abolition of the police. We are also celebrating today one small victory here, quite relevant during Pride Month, which is that today, on the day that we're recording, the Supreme Court determines that very logically and quite obviously to us, LGBTQIAA folks are protected under workplace discrimination law. Duh. But so glad to hear that the Supreme Court upheld that. So we're celebrating today, even as we also recognize that this is a moment of great mourning and work. And with all of that in mind, we're going to go for a total tone shift to talk about a movie that a friend alerted me to, and I've seen references to in his social media, and I've been so curious about for so long. So without further ado, I want to welcome my dear friend Jeff Gan to the show. Jeff, can you tell the people about yourself?
Hi, hello. My name is Jeff. My last name is Gan. I'm a PhD student at UT. I hate that that's what I go through first, but that is who I am. I am originally from Washington, D.C., but I am at the University of Texas at Austin, which I think is really relevant to our conversation about this film today. But I'm so excited to talk with you about this piece of cinema, this thing that we're discussing today.
There's so much to discuss about this film, including our reluctance to ascribe an actual genre to it, because we'll talk about that. And before we get into it too deeply, I'll say that the film we are discussing today is the film Longhorns, the year of our Lord. Oh yeah, Longhorns, hook 'em. The year of our Lord 2011. And Google, Jeff, I don't know if you know this, but the go-to summary on Google is simply a group of Texas frat boys head to a cabin in the woods and ride each other.
I mean, that is both accurate and really inaccurate. They're not, like, I think only one of them is in a frat. Like, I don't know. We can fact check that in a second, but sure.
Yeah, there's a lot of mutual masturbation. I think there is a lot less writing happening, but we'll get into that.
We'll get into it. It is Longhorns, which I think, if you're not aware, is the mascot / what is the word? Eponym, I guess, of the UT world, the UT nation, the Longhorn nation. Also, I think it's a really convenient syllogism metaphor for a penis, perhaps a very large one would be a longhorn.
Mm-hmm.
I guess that's sort of the pun.
And it's strange because I don't think in the film they ever actually name drop the University of Texas at Austin, but if you are from Texas or know of Texas, it's pretty clear that that's where they're supposed to be.
Yeah, they make a reference to SMU. Friends and I've watched this movie several times, and we watched it again this weekend for this podcast, and we had a drinking game where anytime Austin or UT was telegraphed in some way, we would try to take a sip, and there were a lot of them. But I think you do have to be kind of savvy to catch some of them, right? The main character in his dorm room has a burnt orange phone. I think they play the fight song at certain times, under a sort of diegetic music maybe underneath certain scenes that happen on campus. And there are many shots of both the Austin skyline and also the university itself. You can see all this stuff that definitely was not there when the movie was set, which I believe is either 1984 or 1982.
1982.
82. Okay, cool. So I guess then we're also in a sort of pre-AIDS sort of era as well. So I do find it really significant that I was reading some interviews with the director, and he was quick in 2011 to emphasize that this film is has some claim on authenticity because everyone in the cast, or most of the cast, was Southern, but he doesn't name anyone as Texan specifically. So I find that a fascinating thing in which there's this evocation of Texas, this proposed, I don't want to call it an ethnography of Texas in the 80s, historiography maybe, that it seems to involve no actual Texans in the first place.
Yes, as a native Texan, I have to say that if you're looking for authentic Texana, you go to your Richard Linklaters. That's the man you want to go to. But this movie has so many inaccuracies. It's just absolutely wild.
But it is fascinating to me to see how it is like performed. And like my apologies, please apologies for me being in a performance studies program, but I might abuse that word quite a lot today. But there is this like performance of Texas, or like what Texas could represent, which I find absolutely fascinating. As someone who is not a native Texan, but has lived here in Austin and has been a grad student at UT for the past 4 years. Oh my God. I was thinking it's like apropos. Oh gosh, my vocabulary is so pretentious now. This is what happens when you become a grad student, y'all. Like, I was thinking it was apropos that we are having this discussion, Jonelle, myself, and Eliza, as we were all involved, if I'm not mistaken, in a like college Shakespeare group. And I was thinking in the shower today when I was pondering this film, and not in a nasty way, but in like a very like straightforward way, that like this film, like Texas is to this film as like Illyria or like Bohemia is to Shakespeare, right? But I think it is sort of it's like a pastoral, like literally they go to the country, they go to this like, for most of the movie, this main character retreats to a like rural cabin where they are isolated and have to like work out some of their problems. But I think it's also a sort of pastoral for what I perceive to be the audience of the film, which I take to be like cis gay men, and probably like cis gay white men on the West Coast specifically. Like it's a sort of like Abercrombie ad Texas, which becomes like very pronounced, I think, in certain moments, where like you have people lounging around in like Sherpa-lined denim jackets with like athletics, like tube socks and like cut off shorts and no shirt, which is like absurd. Like, why would you ever wear that? But it is like what Texas could be represent in the erotic imaginary of the audience.
Yeah, that's a big question that I have, I think, for you about this film is what does the role of Texas, and by extension the image of the cowboy, which is evoked often in this film with the symbol of the cowboy hat, and even the idea of the Longhorn and the pastoral cabin, and the state of Texas in general. I mean, what space does that take up in the sort of gay erotic imagination, and what significance does it have?
I think it signifies like a kind of masculinity. I think that it signifies a kind of, well, I would also say it's really important to note, my perception is that you can see in the character of like the roommate, I guess, or like the first friend that gets like jacked off with in the beginning of the movie, that this sort of like cowboy-fied culture could be used to oppress people, right? It's like it's used to like further the sort of homophobic masculinity that is like really horrible and like damaging to people, and kind of keeps the main character in the closet in many ways. So there's that, right? And then I think there is a kind of like queering of that, in that this dude with this sort of ambiguous drawl who participates in these rituals and these symbols inside of this imaginary, he like performs that he's like struggling with this kind of masculinity. But I think because it's forbidden, and because it's often positioned as being like antithetical to a kind of like a queer sexuality or a queer identity, that it's like subversion or its forbiddenness is something that is like that can be transgressed in like a really sexy, like a really hot kind of way, right? So that I think is what is at play. But I also feel like the director doesn't really give a shit enough to like keep that like dynamic going, so it like collapses really fast inside of the movie, as I think you can see. Should we like summarize the plot? I mean, it's not a very popular gay movie, I don't think.
Yes. We dove in too deep. I got too excited about the very short summary on Google. But the longer summary that is a little bit better. But although I would take up some issue with the way that it's describing the film, but it's what's provided on IMDb by the creators, is back in 1982, a Texas university student, very notably that they don't specifically name the University of Texas at Austin, which is something we can talk about more, who was curious about the male sex fantasies, I would put in liberal quotes, he had been having, decides that he needs to hook up with an out gay student on campus.
What is this like tense? What is this like this present tense situation? I just think that the way this summary is written is kind of strange.
I have yet to read a summary of this film that actually gets at what it's about, which like if I had to summarize it, I would say young Kevin
University of Texas at Austin student, has experienced sexual feelings for masculine and male-bodied people his entire life, we come to learn. At the university, he has continued the practices of having same-sex sexual activities that he believes himself to just be sort of part of his regular straight man activities, despite a world substituting for Texas being shorthand for homophobia in this case, I suppose. In a world where he is being told that that's not acceptable, he can't be gay, he runs into a student on campus named Cesar, who's an out gay student, and also the only character of color in this film, so far as we can tell. And he struggles with his feelings for Cesar as they have what is explicitly homosexual, gay-identified sex, as opposed to the same-sex sexual activities he's been having with his friends since childhood.
Yeah,
and he has some weird feelings about it.
Which is like mutual masturbation, I think, in the most part,
yes,
right?
Yes, for the most part, that is what it is.
But like, I think it's fascinating to me that the way that this film is structured is that Kevin has this sort of like in the moment, like present tense narration that is happening where he is like, which usually serves to like dismiss or like disqualify any sort of like same-sex attraction that he is having, any sort of act that he is committing or has committed, that it's sort of the voice of his self-denial, or as I think Cesar puts it, sort of delusion or self-delusion. You'll like masturbate together with his roommate or best friend. It's not really clear if they live together. Who's very homophobic. And then afterwards will be like, all guys do this. That'll be like the sort of voiceover voice. All guys do this. That's not weird at all. You know, or he'll like kiss Cesar and then be like, dang, that's Cesar for tricking me. You know, sort of this like this like cartoonish, like, I don't know, like self-deluded, closeted voice. And then the drama of it sort of hinges around disrupting that and how that voice comes to terms sort of with itself. But yeah, so it's like he doesn't perceive himself to he doesn't identify as gay. He doesn't, I think, really identify as a man who has sex with men. He identifies as like a man who does normal man things, which includes like jerking off your friends.
Yes, exactly. I was telling Jeff before we got on to the recording here that if you're neck deep in queer theory, as I am to a certain degree, and Jeff is probably more so, there is an implicit, I would argue, criticism in this film, which is actually a lot more complex than I really expected from it. Which is this, there is a way in which this film points out how often we conflate the sort of identity, so let's put that in brackets, right? The identity of being gay, being a gay man, as being something that is the only thing that encapsulates same-sex activities. But of course that's not true because, men who have sex with men are not always identifying themselves as gay. Sometimes they're identifying themselves as bisexual or some other sort of sexual identity, or not at all, as straight. So in those cases, I mean, what you're seeing there is maybe this film pointing out that the identity itself is not inherently tied to the activity, that there's not this like magical moment when you have a sexual encounter with a person of the same sex and then go, my God, I'm gay.
Indeed. Yeah, and I think that there is like, I would say there's nuance, and that makes it sound like something cool is about to happen. I think there's like unfortunate undercutting of that towards the end of the film, right? Which maybe we can get to, but I'll put a pin in that, in the sort of final like agnagnoresis, a sort of like revelation, like, you know, scene that the main character has like at the very end. These characters, do you want to keep reading the summary? I assume it goes on to talk about the cabin.
No, that is the entire summary offered on IMDb. Again, there's no good summary of this movie.
Like
I'm not lying.
The first third of the movie, which I also find really fascinating because if you follow, like I do, if you were perhaps once upon a time a little closeted like gay boy with a BitTorrent account and you torrented all of these movies to watch them, so for your reasons when you were like 12 or 13, the dramaturgy of a gay movie often would end where this movie meets about the third point, which is about the end of that summary. You know, like these two characters, they overcome their battles, like they're like the ingenues, the lovers, and they like come together. Whatever issue is between them, it's like then we can be together is like always the end, and it is still the end in Longhorns. But what I find really kind of subversive about the way the movie is structured is that, as in that thing that you just read, Jonelle, the first third of the movie is Kevin and Cesar, like, well, really Kevin, like coming to terms with that he has this attraction to Kevin, and then he like freaks out and like leaves, like he like leaves the university to go hang out with his childhood friends in this cabin, I suppose somewhere in the hill country, although I suspect that was filmed somewhere outside of San Diego. Yeah, so there's this entire third of the movie where you have like an A plot and a B plot. And the A plot is Kevin, this like white student who is, I guess, the main character, is like hanging out in denial with his two childhood friends, Steve, who is played by Dylan Vox, who is himself a porn actor, like a gay porn actor, I think I'll put out there, I believe. And the other of whom is the character whose name I always forget because I feel like he probably shouldn't even be in the movie. I don't really understand what role he plays.
Daniel, who
just like, my God, whenever he's on camera, bless his heart, it just feels like there's a black hole just sucking the energy like out of the scene. I'm just like, why are you here? Like, what's going on? So Kevin's like hanging out, like he's like jacking off his friend Steve. He's like at one point trying to suck Steve's dick, which are all, I guess, practices that they had when they were in high school, although Daniel seems like he was maybe like kind of a prude or something. I don't really know, or wasn't really into that, and only reluctantly joins their circle jerk at this sort of comedic moment. And so this is where Kevin like processes all of his feelings about Cesar and comes to realize that, in the words of the movie, he's delusional. That's like the A plot, right? But then there's this B plot, right? Which I think feels like well-trod ground for a lot of queer movies, but I think it would be a complication in the framework of being like a romantic comedy, right? So I'm interested to hear like your thoughts on this like B plot of like Cesar, his best friend, and this like homophobic student. Like, what did you think of that?
Well, that's the part of this film that I find the most intriguing, and is why I'm glad we're talking about it, is that in structure, I would argue, as you say, what's strange about this movie is it's not necessarily sort of like the sex romp film genre that you would think it is. It's structured like a romantic comedy, as you say. There's two characters who have feelings for each other, obstacles get in the way, side characters intervene, but ultimately they come together and become a couple in the end of the movie. But I think that what's intriguing to me about that, and I want to know more about your feeling about this, I'm not familiar with these movies, this kind of subgenre of film, but what struck me about this movie is that I went in thinking like, oh, this is going to be a rom-com, and being like, oh, this has got a lot of sort of like softcore porn setups, right? Like even the way that the film is shot is like a porn in terms of like the characters, in terms of how the film is framed, in terms of the sheer amount of full frontal nudity.
Yeah. Okay, so I think I should mention one thing, dear listeners, about this film if you haven't seen it, which is I believe that somewhere in these actors' contracts, all of the male actors, or like the penis having actors in this movie, I think they were all required to show their penis like full frontal. And when I say like full frontal, I mean often like dead on, flat, front light, anatomical situation, right? The nudity in this movie is never like some, Kate Winslet, like draw me like one of your French girl situation. It is like here to be seen, And you're right. I think that what you're picking up on is something that I feel very similarly, which is that it feels, I think it's not even like softcore, because softcore is about these lingering like pan shots. Don't know why, if you are familiar with this, but the 1313 series is like a horror softcore series. And Dante's Cove is kind of like this as well, where it'll be like, now we'll have like a 5 to 7 minute long scene in which our like hunky straight character like takes a shower, and then we like linger over his body in these ways. That is not how the nudity is treated in this. I think it's treated for a laugh, but I think it's also treated like we're going to see these people's entire dicks. You know what I mean?
That's what I couldn't figure out. I kept thinking like, well, what I feel like I'm watching here is an erotic scenario, but not it. Well, I guess this is where we get into some like theory, y'all. Here we go.
Yep.
This question of what I'm watching is pornography, but what I'm watching is not necessarily erotic per se, which is really intriguing, because the way that it's shot is that all of the full frontal nudity is like they're right of camera, as you say, Jeff. They're cut off at the knees, right of camera, and the angle is from someone who's laying down on a bed.
Yeah.
So it's like you say, it doesn't have any of that sort of erotic plot specificity that you would expect.
And I think what I'm thinking of is some of like the feminist, oh gosh, this is so dorky, like some of like the feminist like film studies and media studies stuff that I've been reading this semester about like the dismemberment of like women's bodies like by the camera frame itself, and like the sort of male gaze like taking apart a woman's body. Like, so now you see her like legs, and now like it pans up, and you never see her as like an individual person, but rather like an assemblage of things. And I'm thinking about, like you're saying, this point of view of the camera as if you were laying on the bed looking up at the body of this person cut off from the knees, which I'm sure disappoints our foot fetishists out there.
Sorry, guys.
Sorry about that. But yeah, I think that it is, and I think it's also, like you're saying, it's like not erotic in the way that I think in the Academy, especially those of us who are interested in performance, or like Black feminist work, or like interested in the erotic. You know, it's definitely not like the Audre Lorde would not watch this movie and be like, yes, exactly.
Audre Lorde would be concerned, I think.
I think she'd be kind of concerned. But I think that the abruptness of it comes from like two places. One of which is I think is a material place. And so I'm getting back into this like media studies world where we talk about production, like nodes of production, audience. And I think that part of it is that like if you watch a lot of these movies, as little 13-year-old Jeff certainly did, it becomes very clear very fast that particularly movies that are distributed by TLA Releasing, which this movie was, come from this production context where I think they just have fewer resources than many other movies that exist. You know, they kind of exist in this like B horror level of like production value, and I think an investment in resourcing. If you look at the credits from this kind of movie, if you look at the credits for other movies I would consider of its ilk, comedies like Not Another Gay Teen Movie, rom-coms like Is It Just Me? Often what you'll see is that like the producers do double duty all over the place. So you'll have writer, director, producers. Sometimes you'll have like writer, lead actor, director, producers. I think Is It Just Me is like that. I think on this film, one of the producers was also the person who scored the film and did all of the sound. So it's like clear that people are like scrapping in a way that to me is like evocative of like queer work in a way, right? Like the sort of like scrappy like for us, by us, our limited money that we have to make this thing happen. And you can see that, I think, in the way that the film itself is produced. Like, the lighting is not, like, beautifully... This isn't Wong Kar-wai. You know, this isn't, like, Barry Jenkins. This is, like, flat lighting in rooms that look like... They look like porn sets, I think, because they didn't have a lot of money to, like, dress them, you know? So I think that there's, like, a resource element to this feel, and which comes back to, like, I don't know, like, it's a relationship to porn, you know? I don't think that anyone is masturbating to this movie. I don't think that anybody... I mean, maybe people are. I don't want to speak for everyone. I'm not, you know? Because the nudity is like so abrupt and like so in your face. I think it's for humor. I think it's like for a laugh. And the director talks about like the frontal situation, I think in those terms in this Q&A that I found with the San Diego lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender news.com. I did some research, y'all. There's this question from the interviewer. How do film festival audiences react to the full frontal male nudity? Answer, they love it, not only because it's sexy and funny, but also because it fits very naturally into the story. That's a lie. That's not true.
Just not at all.
College kids did crazy things when I went to school. That is perhaps true. My hunch is that hasn't changed, right? So I think he sees it as like I don't know. I think he sees it applied element, but I think it's also for humor. It's for like shock value. It's like the penis coming out, which is something that we're just not accustomed to in like straight cinema, right? We're not accustomed to full frontal male nudity in this way. The penis coming out is like it's like a jump scare, you know? It's like like there it is. But it lingers in this way that I think doesn't really do that metaphor justice, but I think that that's sort of the dramaturgical function that it plays.
You know what's funny, though, Jeff, is that I remember very distinctly in the opening moments of this film, our main character, Kevin, is being ridden by a cowgirl cheerleader. There are, by the way, dear listeners, a lot of references to Debbie Does Dallas, and yet they don't actually specifically name drop that film either. So there's a lot of interesting like evocations of stuff without actually citing them. But what I wanted to say was that in the moment when he's being ridden by this cheerleader, in this moment of like stereotypical straight college sexuality, he's distracted by looking at his plants. And this shot is so interesting because what the film tells us about it narratively, what we get from Kevin's narration is that he's so bored by the sex that he's lingering on the plants and thinking about needing to water them. But all I could think about was like, this is the queerest shit. I love this. Yeah. First of all, the plant was incredibly phallic. And then also I feel like caring for plants is a very queer sort of act of care. But you tell me what you think.
I think that is my perception as well, but on this last watch through, because I remember this shot where he looks at this bromeliad that like has a bright red tip. If you don't know what it looks like, it's sort of like a spiny like thing that shoots up a big spike in the middle. And he thinks about like, oh, I need to water it. So I think that yes, he is bored. Yes, he also has these plants, which another character says is like a very gay, like shitty thing to do, I guess, in a homophobic way later on in the movie. But we also get further like the plants actually serve like a key function in the film's like drama, like in its story. In that, like, Kevin talked about, we learned about his childhood, we learned that he wasn't allowed to have pets, so all he had were plants, and so he loved these plants deeply. He's often tending to them, like, when he's being vulnerable with people. When he, like, flees to when he flees to Illyria, you know, he like tells his homophobic friend slash roommate, I'm still not clear if they live in the same room, that he needs to like water the plants. Then is this like starts this critical plot function. It's like the handkerchief in like Othello, where by which Cesar reads the note left for the homophobic friend and then sees the number of the cabin where the phone number of the cabin where Kevin is staying, and then they can have these like confrontations via phone. Like that's how that information traffics, right? Through this note, it's like, here's how you care for my plants, which also is like just the most like high maintenance gay shit that I can imagine. Like leaving someone a long ass note being like, here's how you care for like these 3 plants that I have. They're named, you know, like, so I found it to be like actually like the plants to be like a complex site in many ways, of like nuance in this film that is so lacking nuance. I think that like but you're mentioning this first shot, and I forgot that like the film opens by sort of like doing what I think is again like a horror movie, like a really beautiful, brief kind of like setting of expectations and then immediate subversion. So it starts with like this shot of Kevin's like corkboard in his dorm room. So there's like this like watercolor of like a pastoral Texan scene. There is like a pinup of like a frontal pinup of a woman, and there's like a photo of Ronald Reagan. Like it's just like there.
Yes.
You see that's the image, and then like what you hear is like the sound of like fornication. I believe you hear like a vocal woman happening at this time. So it's like trying to set up, it's trying to like collapse all of these things that are used to like evoke the time, the sort of atmosphere of the movie. Like all of them, I think in what feels to me like a really dramaturgically satisfying way, are like revisited and like subverted. I think that like the best example of this is Cesar comes into Kevin's room, right? Do you remember this? Where he comes in for the first time and is like pointing out all this stuff and is like, oh, Reagan, like, oh, I feel like you're a fan of Ronnie or whatever. And Kevin says, yeah, it's morning again in America. And then this phrase becomes a kind of refrain that occurs both when Kevin is like feeling like when he escapes to the cabin and feels like he's like, oh, like that's all behind me now, it's morning again in America. And also at the very end of the movie when he's made peace with his identity and sexuality, I suppose. And it's like seeing a bright new morning for himself and Cesar. So I really hesitate to be like any parts of this movie are satisfying or like beautiful, but I do find the corkboard.
Yeah, and I think that if there's one thing that I am especially interested in with this movie, and we've already touched on this a lot, but I think it's worth repeating again, that I'm a native Texan, born and raised in Houston, Texas, H-Town till I drown.
Yes, you are. Yes,
and
ma'am.
you have adopted our great city of Austin. So one of the things that I think is really that could be very intriguing about this movie for people who are not familiar with Texas and all that it is and is not is this question of queer Texana. We've made references to it before, but I want to unpack it a little bit more. I mean, Texas as a sort of pastoral vision is one thing, but I think that it's important also for people to know that Texas does now and has always had a queer subculture, a strong queer subculture.
Indeed.
So I want to talk more about like the reality behind this movie's sort of light parody.
Yeah, I think that, and again, I caveat all of this by saying I am a transplant, although I live here now. It's not Walker Lukens or Waylon Jennings, but there's a song, right? That's right, you're not from Texas, but Texas wants you anyway, right? I consider myself adopted by this state in some ways. I think in the contemporary moment, which is I could speak to a lot more easily than 1982 in Texas, Austin, I believe, has one of like the highest like trans per capita populations in the country. It's a very trans like feeling city when you were here. I think that there's some critique about the sort of racialization of that, but I think it is true. I think as well, of course, I mean, if we want to look back into film, like we have films like Dallas Buyers Club, which dramatize the like healthcare activism that gay and queer people were undertaking in the state of Texas, like around the AIDS crisis, which I assume, again, was going to break shortly after the setting of this movie. So I think that there is like a lot of like real ass Texana, but if you acknowledge that too forcefully, I feel like it breaks the armature of the movie. It breaks the erotic heat of the movie, which is that of what is forbidden, which is why I think the character of Cesar is like so fascinating in this way, right? That he's like this other person, both because he is not white and he is an out gay man who is like proudly out. He's like an activist on campus in some way, right? And is like out here like manipulating people. Also kind of a horrible trope, but like, you know, it's there a little bit of this like gay brown person like manipulating these white straight boys. But also I'm like, work, you know. I'm like, but I think that also, like, in my, again, I go to UT, I'm looking down my nose at everyone that comes with the territory, I guess, unfortunately, and it feels like it is the most possible at a place like UT, where there is this kind of like activist, weird hippie spirit that of late I think has been commercialized and like capitalized upon, and I use that word deliberately in the city of Austin. The movie wouldn't work if you were really open to like how many gay and queer people there are, and like what kinds of things that they are up to. You know, like they don't go to like Esther's Follies like
Right.
in the film. The queerness only exists in this like rotten Cesar, and everyone else seems to be floating in this like straight soup out there, which I think again is a function of like there's not like a coast of Bohemia, you know, like you don't need one. Like if you're imagining it, then it doesn't really matter to you. Star is sort of the fly in the ointment of this.
Yeah, I think that if there is definitely a distinct experience of watching this movie if you are from Texas or you adopted Texas, that especially with the character of Cesar, who I certainly am not an expert on queer people of color in Texas, but I would say that there are certain things about his character that if you are from Texas, you sort of start to flag as like odd, right? So the film positioning the one character of color as this sort of closet key, a term that I learned from Urena in our last episode. Thanks, Urena. So this character of color being a closet key, and also presumably, and I am making an assumption here, but I would presume that Cesar is supposed to be a person of Mexican descent. Which in Texas in the 80s, I mean, could mean that you're first gen, it could mean that you're sixth generation, could mean you're so many generations back in Texas that you've always been there with your family, right? That your family has been in Texas before Texas was Texas. So I think that the politics of that are really intriguing, right? Like there's almost a more interesting, like intellectual, like art house version of this movie where they get into the complexity of like what it means to be a Texan through Cesar's experience as a queer Latinx person. But that's not this movie.
Yeah, it's not. And I feel like, oh man, I'm about to sound like a homophobic critic in a way, but I do think that like the gay, I almost feel like the camp, oh my god, these words coming out of my mouth. I almost feel like the camp surfaces of the movie get in the way of that kind of thing, right? So like the need to show the dick of every single person, the need for the erotics of it to be based again on this sort of like white straightness or subversion or transgression of it, which is again for laughs. It's for like it's like to get the audience like fanning itself in the theater. I think it gets in the way of like what could be an interesting movie about like what it means for this character to be out. We don't know how he came out really. Like we don't know where in Texas he is from. We don't know, I guess, where anyone is from in Texas in this movie. We just know so little about him except for the surfaces that he can give us, right? That he is out, that he looks the way that he does, that he is interacting with these characters in these ways, right? We know nothing about the sort of interiority of this character, except that this ring means a lot to him, I guess. Like
all of these Shakespeare tropes that show up in these fucking rom-coms, they never stop. Someday I'm gonna like do a mega episode about it. It's crazy.
It's strange, y'all. But yeah, I think there's just all of that. I think it's also like, I don't know, and maybe again, so if you are all interested in the University of Texas at Austin, perhaps you are. There is a really great like immersive tour that the university put out where they take you basically around. You can like with your phone or your camera like pan around these different stops on campus, and they tell about like the racist and sexist history of the campus itself, which is deep, right? So I was about to say, it also surprises me that there are no other people of color in this movie because, again, in my perception of UT now, it is one that is fought several times over desegregation, over affirmative action. Queer people of color are certainly around, certainly not in the numbers that I would perhaps be happy with, but like are a force in the way that is sort of collapsed into this one character. There are queer people here, there are gay people here, there are like, and here I mean Texas like as an entire state the size of Germany. There are queer people of color all over the place. There are queer Black people, queer Latinx people, queer Indigenous people. Feels like a function of the sort of coastal fantasy, the coastal gay male fantasy, to be like, oh well, we'll have this one person who's out and is the closet key, but like everyone else is going to be this like straight mass bro character who just jerk off together. Which I don't want to disparage, y'all. Like I don't want to disparage that at all. Listen. That's great. Please, if that is your practice, do that. And do it with, like, verve, Like, do it with, like, many kinds of lubricant. I think that the representation of this is being the only, it's just, like, it feels like a thin representation, which I don't know why I feel like that's a surprise or you need to comment almost as a function of like gay rom-coms or gay cinema in general.
Well, but let me ask you, Jeff. So that I think is maybe like the place where I'd love us to land with this, is to talk briefly about what function you think this movie and movies like it serve for. I mean, we could say certainly like gay cinema, gay pop culture, but also maybe just like how does it serve the fantasies and the fun of men who like to have sex with men?
I think that like, and I think I might end up using the first person a lot in this because I did encounter this movie as a like horny teenager who is voraciously consuming this kind of media and coming to terms with my own sexuality identity, right? So the role that it like played for me was as a corrective to the illusion of like gay experiences, representation in media. And that is why these sorts of films, as awful, terrible as they are, truly, I think that's why they were so important to me, is because it felt like this like stand against silence, against a feeling of isolation. If you're not familiar with The Celluloid Closet, it's a book, I believe, and also a film, which on HBO, naturally, a documentary about the presence of like queer people in cinema, mostly American cinema, but in cinema. Someone in the documentary says that like all people who are part of a minority watch films with hope that they will see a reflection of themselves somewhere in there, I think that you could take issue with the sort of totalizingness of all people, all minorities in this. But for me, that certainly rings true. So this movie, as shitty as it was, it's this like initial step that feels very early 2000s of being like certain people in our community have enough capital, have enough say that they can produce documents that are reflective of their fantasies and their experiences without having to like shoehorn them into, in a coded way, some other person, some straight person's product or project. So it feels like a great affirmation in this way. And I think it's really easy for me to sit in the chair that I'm sitting in right now and be like, Longhorns is trash. None of the gay teen movie is trash. It's just like fluff. But I do think that it serves this like really important role. Maybe continues to serve, maybe past tense serves, of like a certain segment of our community, like marshaling its resources to put up something that it wanted to see. And I think that's like really important. And it was affirming for me when I saw it. And I think that I don't have that same experience of affirmation now because I feel like I don't know, my brain is so huge. Like I have like expanded my view of what can be queer cinema. I think I can now recognize I can sit with you in this podcast and like talk shit about the movie and how like white it is, like how like not representative of actual Texas culture, which is disappointing. But I do think that if we're going to take a sort of like incrementalist view, that this is like an important step in our community, or at least again part of it, like telling our community stories. It's sort of for us bias politics. Assume, Jonelle, it's not a movie for you. It's not a movie for a like straight audience. It is a like adaptation of a genre which has excluded us. The rom-com is like a seizing of that, and I think almost a subversive way in order to like show our stories. And again, I think now that we've reached that point, we can go back and be like, and what's up with it? Why is there only one character of color, and that one person is the closet key who is magical and fixes everyone's problems? Like, I think we can go to that place as well. Like, we need to hold that critique too.
Yeah, I think I love that as a point for us to land on here and raise a glass to acknowledging the service of films like this that are for, by, and about a community. And also holding those movies accountable for actually reflecting that community. So here's to more of that and more fucking rom-coms that are not for me, straight white lady. All right, so before we move on to what I am really excited about for this episode, our delightful anecdotes for Longhorns, we need to give a shout out to our patrons from Patreon who keep this thing going and who this month, shout out. And who this month have enabled us to make a donation to Raji P. Henson's foundation for getting greater mental health care to the Black community. So patrons, thank you so much for that. And our patrons are Bob, Esther, Emily, Robert, Sean, and Tim. Y'all continue to be rock stars. Thank you so much. All right, Jeff, what are your anecdotes for Longhorns?
I think my antidote to this movie, if you're looking for a movie of its ilk that I just feel like we can stand behind more as a community, is But I'm a Cheerleader. I think that is what I would hold up as the anti-Longhorns, in that I think it's a very queer movie. I think it's centered on like women and their experiences. Clea Duvall is in that. If you're into lesbian cinema, like, oh my God, you know that she's like the star of many of these movies of the early 2000s. I think it has a more interesting production design, and I think it's had more longevity. Yeah, Natasha Lyonne and Clea Duvall having like a teenage romance in a gay conversion camp. It's like beautiful, it's hilarious, and I think that's a much superior film. Okay, there's one thing that I would like to say and maybe add in that I forgot to say earlier. As we're recognizing like the moment that we were in, I think that an important thing to acknowledge, especially coming from where I'm coming from in Austin, is, well, one, like the incredible violence of the Austin Police Department, and then two, that there has been so much activism on campus, and that like the Longhorn identity has been a like thing to organize around. So there's a way in which like symbols of this university, which to an outsider like me is on its face kind of corny, or is on its face a sort of hollow burnt orange surface, can also be a site of like subversion against the system and in defense of Black lives and in defense of dignity, and like an attack on like white supremacy that is still alive and well on our campus. So I think that like if we're going to talk about Longhorns and we're going to talk about this moment that we're in, I think that is a really beautiful way in which those two things connect, and that needs to be mentioned.
I think that connects to that greater thing about Texas too, right? Which is that there's so much about Texas and the history of Texas that is shameful and embarrassing. So like, let's take the upcoming commemoration of Juneteenth, for example. It is a fucking disgrace that enslaved people in Texas, in Galveston, Texas, where my parents live, did not hear about emancipation until 2 years after the document was signed. Yeah, That's a fucking disgrace. Mm-hmm. But that event and that moment of history has been turned around by Black Texans and Black Americans into this incredible celebration of freedom and Black excellence and Black culture and liberation.
Yeah.
And so I like to say that I think there are a lot of things in Texas that are like that, where yes, the fierce individualism and the weird nationalism can be used for evil, but can also be used for good. You know, moments when we can rally around and say, like, you know, I was at the protest in Houston for George Floyd that was led by his family. He's a native Houstonian. And, you know, what I heard so many people say, people who previously had never marched for Black life, I kept hearing people say, he was one of our own. He was one of our own. Mm-hmm. He was a Texan. He was a Houstonian. And that sort of mentality can be used for evil. But again, it can also be really used for good. So I'm glad to hear that UT students are doing that same work. This actually leads, I think, into my antidote, which for the first time on the podcast, I am not doing a film or a book or a play. I am recommending an album. My antidote for Longhorns is the absolutely incredible album Pony by Orville Peck. And that is...
He's not from Texas. Wait a second.
He's Canadian. He's a Canadian. Let's be clear. He's a Canadian. But I will say this. I think Orville Peck is an amazing, incredible artist with a lot of reverence for not only the iconography of the cowboy, the iconography of the Lone Ranger specifically, and the history of country music and its queerness, but also is injecting this level of queer sensibility, and specifically like a gay sensibility to his music, to his imagery. His music videos are incredibly beautiful, and he's also just such a positive and wonderful presence. It's so encouraging. He's got a new EP called Show Pony coming out next month that he pushed so that he can focus more on uplifting Black artists instead of promoting himself. But I just think that what he offers is a different vision and a different understanding of what it can mean to be a sort of a queer cowboy. And his music is beautiful and moody and incredibly romantic and amazing. And I want to balance that too by saying that similarly, if you're more academically inclined, I would recommend you to read the chapter Dancing Reggaeton with Cowboy Boots, Frictive Encounters in Queer Latinidad by Ramon Rivera Cervera. It's a really amazing chapter, even if you're not super, super academic or you're not into dance scholarship. I mean, this chapter is just an amazing, wonderful account of queer Latinx people in, reggaeton clubs, but repping like the cowboy iconography, right? It's such a beautiful synthesis, I think, of everything that is complex about the South, the Southwest, the borderlands, as Gloria Anzaldúa would say. So those are my antidotes, folks. The 2019 album Pony by Orville Peck, and the wonderful chapter Dancing Reggaeton with Cowboy Boots by Ramon Rivera Cervera. Jeff, thank you so much for coming in here to talk to me about this movie. And also our shared love for Texas.
Oh, I hope something like this would happen, Jonelle. I really did. There were so many movies we could have talked about. There were so many. There were movies that are like actually good that we could have talked about as well. But I knew that if we threw down Longhorns, that like we would have a beautiful conversation about Texas and what Texas means between us. And I think that I am so glad that we got to talk about this.
Me too. Motherfucking hook 'em, Jeff.
Hook 'em.
Thank you for listening to the RomCom Killjoys podcast. If you liked this episode, make sure to follow us on Facebook and Instagram at RomCom Killjoys. And if you'd like to support us further, you can become a patron at patreon.com/romcomkilljoys to gain access to exclusive bonus content. Our theme song is Lady Slut Hitchhike Love by the band A Giant Dog. And the song you're listening to now is a cover of one of my favorites, Baby Love, by Colin Langanis. Remember, Killjoys, don't let anyone kill your joy. Not a rom-com, not me, not anyone. See you next time.